The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs and makes every breath feel borrowed. A single shaft of light cut through the high windows, dust particles floating like slow confessions in the air. On the stand sat Officer Elena Cruz, a decorated cop, a woman who had once been a beacon of order in her city. Now she was broken down to her uniform's shadow, stripped of rank, stripped of respect, staring at the judge, as if the floor beneath her had vanished. When the gavel cracked, it was not just wood against wood. It was the sound of a life being sealed shut, sentenced to death. The words rang like thunder in her skull. Around her, whispers rose like wind through dead leaves. Reporters scribbled, strangers gasped. Elena barely moved, only her jaw tightened, her hands trembling in cuffs. And yet, beyond the cold walls, outside the barbed fences and concrete barriers, a German shepherd named Koda waited. He didn't understand trials or verdicts or death sentences. All he knew was loyalty, the kind that does not bend with human judgment. And when the world turned its back on Elena, Koda did the unthinkable. The gavel struck like a gunshot. One sound and the room changed. The murmurs died, replaced by a silence so heavy she could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Her wrists ached beneath the bite of the shackles. But the greater pain was the cold finality sliding into her chest as the word "death" echoed through the chamber. She had heard gunfire, she had stood over bodies, she had written too many reports on lives cut short. But this was different. This wasn't a loss she witnessed. It was hers. She searched the rows of faces, some hardened in anger, others lit with grim satisfaction. Reporters scribbled notes, pens scratching like tiny blades. A camera flash burst white in the corner, turning the polished wood of the benches into brief shards of glass. She tried to swallow, but her throat refused. She was no longer a cop, no longer even a woman with a name. In their eyes, she was only a headline, disgraced officer sentenced to die. But then she saw him. Through the glass doors at the back, Koda sat, massive frame taut, ears pricked. His amber eyes locked on hers with a ferocity that cut through the suffocating quiet. The German shepherd did not understand the weight of the verdict, but he understood her. To him, she was not condemned. She was his handler, his partner, his reason to rise each day. His nails scraped the tiled floor as he inched forward, body trembling with a low whine that crawled beneath the guard's boots and up her spine. The bailiff's hand clamped on her arm, pulling her up. Metal clinked against wood. Koda rose at the same time, muscles tense, a mirror of her movement. Like a tether invisible to everyone else bound them together. She wanted to shout his name, but the words caught against her teeth. Strangled by pride, by shame, by the raw terror curling in her gut. The courtroom blurred. The polished seal above the judge's bench, the tight faces of the jury, even the cold eyes of the press, all dissolved into noise. Only Koda's gaze stayed sharp, burning like a flame in the fog. They dragged her toward the side door. She stumbled once, knees buckling, and the chain between her wrists rattled like cruel applause. Someone coughed, someone whispered, but Koda's growl cut through. Low and guttural, vibrating like thunder from a storm rolling in. A guard barked at him to sit, but Koda didn't flinch, didn't blink. He pressed his body forward, chest straining against the handler's grip, a soldier refusing to stand down. In that split second, she wanted to collapse. Not from weakness, but because she realized he would not leave. Not willingly. The thought hollowed her chest with both relief and dread. She had nothing left, her name tarnished, a future erased. But she still had him, and that was both her salvation and her curse. The heavy door groaned open, spilling harsh fluorescent light across the floor. She turned her head just enough to see him once more. His ears were still high, his eyes unyielding, as if he could burn a hole through the barrier and follow her anywhere. She tried to memorize it, that face of unbroken loyalty, because she feared it might be the last thing she would ever see. The door shut. The chains rattled again, and for the first time truly, she understood what silence could do. It wasn't empty. It was a prison of its own. The cell was smaller than any room she had ever known, smaller even than the cramped patrol cars she once spent her nights in. 4 walls, thick with peeling paint and the stench of bleach that never truly masked the sweat and despair soaked into the concrete. The cot groaned each time she shifted. its thin mattress doing little to soften the weight of her body or the thoughts pressing down on her chest. She had worn the uniform once, crisp and proud, with Koda trotting beside her like a shadow stitched to her boots. Now she wore grey, faceless, her badge nothing more than a memory swallowed by headlines and verdicts. Yet every week, when they allowed visitors, life returned in the form of paw prints. She would hear him before she saw him. The scratch of claws against linoleum, the soft wine slipping past the guard's boots. Koda had a way of pulling her upright when she thought she couldn't bear another day. Behind the glass divider, he would leap onto his hind legs, pressing his paws against the barrier, fogging the cold surface with his breath. His eyes found hers instantly, amber burning through every layer of fatigue and shame, as though reminding her she wasn't invisible, not to him. She lifted the heavy phone receiver, her hand trembling not because of chains this time, but because of the unbearable fragility of this ritual. She whispered his name, and on the other side, his ears twitched, his head cocked as if straining to understand every word. Her voice cracked, and he whined in response, the sound vibrating against the glass, filling the sterile room with a warmth no guard could strip away. Each visit was brief, counted in ticking seconds, but in those moments she felt like herself again, not inmate, not condemned, but simply the woman he trusted with his entire world. When they led him away, his paws skittered against the tile resisting, his gaze dragging over his shoulder until the last possible second. The silence afterward was worse than chains. She curled onto the cot at night, clutching the memory of his eyes, replaying the weight of his loyalty. In a world that had already cast her as forgotten, discarded, guilty beyond redemption, Koda alone refused to let her vanish. But loyalty had its own edge, and she began to see the toll it was taking on him. The handlers mentioned he stopped eating on the days she didn't appear. He paced at night, restless, scratching at doors, as if he could carve a path back to her. His body grew leaner, sharper, but his spirit never dimmed. It was both a gift and a knife twisting in her heart. She had shackles on her wrists, but he carried invisible ones on his soul. Chains forged not of steel, but of love. The guards laughed sometimes, shaking their heads. That dog would wait at the gates forever if we let him. She swallowed the lump in her throat each time she overheard it, because she knew they were right. Koda didn't understand human laws, didn't pass the word death penalty. He only knew she was his, and he was hers. And every step he took closer to wasting away felt like another sentence they hadn't written on paper, but carved into both their hearts. The glass divided them. But in those moments of paw against palm, breath against cold surface, it felt like the only barrier that mattered wasn't physical. It was time. Time ticking away toward an ending she couldn't stop, and he couldn't comprehend. Days lost their names inside the cell. Morning, night. It all bled into a single stretch of time that ticked louder with each breath. She marked them in her head, though, each visit with Koda like a stake hammered into the dirt of collapsing ground. But then the letter arrived, slid under her door, its edges curled, the ink trembling from some clerk's hurried hand. It was short, merciless. The date had been set. She held the paper until it grew damp with the sweat from her palms. Her eyes skimmed the words again and again, but they blurred into nothing but a countdown. 30 days. 4 weeks. Less than a month until silence became permanent. She folded it neatly, slid it under her pillow as if hiding it might delay the truth. But the weight never left her chest. Koda felt it before anyone else. Dogs always do. At the next visit, he didn't leap at the glass. He sat, ears angled back, muscles wound tight as a spring. His eyes darted, restless, searching her face as if to find the thing she was trying to bury inside. When she whispered his name through the receiver, he whined, sharp and urgent, a sound she had never heard from him before. The handlers tugged at his leash, but he resisted, nails scraping furrows into the floor. Body pressed hard against the divider as though he could claw through to her. After that, the reports trickled in. He had stopped eating his full meals, refused water some nights, pacing the kennel until dawn, digging at corners, barking at shadows. She listened in silence as one of the handlers relayed it, his tone somewhere between annoyance and worry. Is not himself anymore. She nodded, but her throat closed before words could escape. because she knew it was her doing. He was unraveling in tandem with her. Back in her cell, she pressed her face into the thin pillow, tears soaking through the coarse fabric. She tried to breathe slow, to keep the sobs quiet enough that the guards wouldn't jeer. But she couldn't stop imagining him. Ribs sharpening under his coat, paws bleeding from frantic scratching, eyes dimming with hunger he couldn't name. He didn't understand the end date. All he knew was that the person he trusted most was slipping, and he couldn't reach her. At night, she dreamed of him. Not as he was now, restless and gaunt, but as he had been on patrol. The feel of his fur brushing against her leg as they walked alleys. The flash of his teeth in moonlight when he cornered a suspect. The way he pressed against her knee after the gunshots stopped, grounding her heartbeat back into rhythm. She woke shaking, the images colliding with the reality of cinder block walls and iron bars. The countdown became a living thing, crawling through her veins. Each tick of the clock louder, each meal harder to swallow. Her body thinned, mirroring his, their decline bound by an invisible tether. The guards noticed. They muttered about weakness, about inevitability. But in her chest, something else began to stir. A fury that their loyalty, hers and Koda's, was being reduced to footnotes in a case file. On the 20th day, Koda's howl pierced the visiting room before she even entered. Long broken, rising from some place too deep for words. The handler struggled, his arms straining to keep the dog from lunging at the divider. She froze, her shackled hands trembling as the sound ripped through her. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a cry. It was grief made flesh, an animal's body breaking under the weight of what it couldn't comprehend. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. He slammed his paw against the same spot, claws squealing against the surface. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside those 4 square feet didn't exist. Just her and him, two creatures caught in a web spun by forces colder than either could fight. She whispered one promise, so soft she wasn't sure if it was meant for him or herself. "You won't be alone." The guard tugged her back, snapping the chain. The receiver clattered from her hand, swinging on its cord. Koda barked once, sharp and desperate, before being dragged away. And for the first time since the verdict, she let herself wonder if something, anything, could break before the date did. The day arrived with the stillness of a storm before lightning. The prison hummed with a mechanical rhythm, keys jangling, doors slamming, guards murmuring in clipped tones. But beneath it all was the heavy awareness of what midnight would bring. She could feel it in her bones. Her last meal sat untouched on the tray, steam curling upward until it thinned into nothing. She traced the rim of the plate with her finger, listening to the silence pressing tighter with every hour. Outside, rain began to fall. Thin at first, tapping the barred window like nervous fingers, then harder, until water streaked down the glass in crooked rivers. She tilted her face toward it, closing her eyes, remembering nights she and Koda had sat in their squad car listening to storms roll across the city. He had never feared thunder. He'd sit upright, alert, unshaken, while her hand rested on his thick fur. That memory burned now, because tonight the storm felt like it belonged to him. Far beyond the prison walls, Koda stirred. The handlers later swore they'd never seen anything like it. One moment he was curled in his kennel, pacing with the same nervous energy that had haunted him for weeks. The next, he was slamming his weight against the gate, teeth tearing at steel, muscles straining with a violence fueled not by rage but desperation. The thunder cracked overhead, and he howled, the sound rising raw and piercing into the night. The latch gave. No one could explain how. Some said a handler hadn't secured it properly. Others whispered it was impossible, that the dog had broken it himself. But when the gate swung wide, Koda didn't hesitate. He bolted, a streak of fur and fury cutting through rain-soaked gravel. Guards shouted, boots pounded after him, but he was faster, driven by something they couldn't chase down. Inside, she sat on the cot, her head in her hands, when the alarm sounded. Sirens wailed through the halls, a chaos she hadn't heard since the streets. She lifted her head, heart hammering, thinking at first it was for her, that they had come early. But then, through the din, a different sound threaded its way to her. The echo of claws on concrete. The bark, that bark, her breath caught. "Koda," she whispered, voice trembling. Down corridors slick with rainwater tracked in by boots, Koda surged. He barreled past legs, teeth snapping at chains, his body a blur of wet fur and fire. Every door that stood in his way became another test of his will. He slammed his body against them, clawed at hinges, until one by one the barriers yielded. Guards cursed, shouted, swung batons, but none could hold him back. He was not attacking, he was cutting a path to her. She stood as the commotion swelled closer, chains at her wrists clattering as her hands shook. The guards at her door braced themselves, weapons ready, but then he appeared. Soaked to the bone, his coat slick with rain and sweat, Koda filled the corridor with a presence that silenced even the loudest shouts. His eyes found hers instantly, wild and blazing, a tether stretched across the chaos. He lunged, teeth snapping the lock like brittle wood, and suddenly he was there, pressing against her, shoving his head beneath her bound hands, whining, growling, refusing to be pulled away. The guards swarmed, shouts rose to screams, batons swung down, but Koda twisted, shielded her with his body, his growls rolling like thunder itself. For a heartbeat, she thought this was how it would end. Not at the execution chamber, but here, in the clash of loyalty against law. But something broke then, not in him, not in her, but in the people watching. The handlers who had known him, the guards who had seen his decline, the staff who whispered at night about injustice. They froze. They saw a dog willing to tear down walls, defy chains, risk everything for the human the system had already condemned. And in that pause, something shifted. A camera snapped, not in the courtroom this time, but here, raw and unfiltered. A story began to write itself, not of a disgraced officer, but of a German shepherd who refused to let her go. The guards hesitated, orders blurred. The chain of command faltered in the face of unrelenting loyalty. And she, standing with her wrists bound and her heart breaking open, realized that whatever happened next, they were no longer just another inmate and her dog. They had become something bigger, an image, a question, a defiance that no gavel could silence. The alarm still screamed, the rain still poured, but in that corridor, time bent. She knelt, pressing her forehead to Koda's wet fur, and for the first time since the verdict, breathed like she was alive. The storm did not end with Koda's arrival. If anything, it deepened. Guards barked orders, radios crackled with frantic voices, and the prison's concrete bones seemed to shudder beneath the chaos. But in the middle of it stood a woman in chains and a dog dripping rainwater onto the floor, bound together by something that no system could contain. They dragged her back, but not before Koda's body had pressed so firmly against hers that she felt the thrum of his heart beating wild against her ribs. That pulse stayed with her long after they tore him away, his claws raking lines across the floor as he fought the leash. His howl carried down the corridor even as the door slammed shut between them. It was not the sound of an animal in anger. It was the sound of devotion breaking itself against iron. The prison wrote it off as a breach. Paperwork was filed, locks replaced, guards reprimanded. Yet nothing in the reports could capture the tremor that moment left behind. The photo leaked, grainy, caught from a guard's phone, of the German shepherd standing defiant in the fluorescent corridor, muscles taut, eyes ablaze, with a chain-bound woman behind him, her head bowed to his fur. It spread like fire through channels far beyond the prison walls. On the outside, people argued. Some said it was proof she wasn't what the headlines had painted. Others claimed it was only a dog's blind instinct. But no one could look at the image without feeling something stir. Justice looked different when filtered through the eyes of loyalty. Systems faltered in the face of a bond that refused to yield. Inside, time crawled on. The date remained inked in black on the calendar. She woke each morning to the sound of keys rattling, footsteps echoing, the knowledge that her story had an ending she could not rewrite. But something inside her shifted after that night. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt erased. Koda had carved her name back into the world, not with words, but with teeth against steel, with the refusal to let her disappear quietly. She thought often of freedom, not the kind promised by release or pardon, but the kind Koda had shown her. Freedom was not walking through gates. It was standing unbroken in the face of them. It was love that refused to be silenced by walls or chains or verdicts. Even knowing what awaited her, she clung to that revelation like oxygen. The final week came. She wrote letters she knew might never be sent, folded memories into words, pressed the weight of her thoughts into paper that smelled faintly of ink and dust. And each time she paused, she thought of Koda. Whether he was pacing, whether he was waiting at the gates, whether his body was growing leaner with every refusal of food. She ached, but she smiled too, because his loyalty was a mirror of hers. Neither of them knew how to surrender. On the last night, the rain returned. She lay awake, listening to its steady rhythm against the window when she heard it, a distant sound that rose above the storm. A howl, long and low, carried by the wind. Her eyes burned as she pressed her hand to the cold wall, as though it could carry her touch to him. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe it was real. But in that moment, it didn't matter. It was Koda. It was always Koda. They came for her at dawn. The guards were silent, their faces unreadable, their boots heavy on the floor. She walked between them, chains at her wrists, head high. Not because she was unafraid, but because she knew she wasn't alone. With every step, she felt the ghost of a paw beside her, the weight of eyes that had never once looked away. No one knows what became of Koda after. Some say he was taken by the handlers, broken, quiet, wasting away in his kennel. Others say he was adopted, given a softer ending. But there were rumors, too, the kind whispered in low voices by guards who swore they saw him waiting at the prison gates long after her name was gone from the roll. They said he would sit through rain and thunder, eyes fixed on the walls as though willing her back. And maybe that was the truest freedom of all. Not escape, not forgiveness, not even survival, but love that outlived the sentence, that refused to be buried in silence. A German shepherd's loyalty, burning against the cold machinery of judgment. In the end, it wasn't the gavel or the cell or even the execution that defined her story. It was Koda standing in the rain, unbroken, waiting, always waiting. The dawn they chose for her was grey. Not bright with promise, not thick with night's forgiving shadows, but grey, the kind of sky that seemed to hesitate between storm and silence. The guards moved with a heaviness that betrayed routine. Their eyes didn't meet hers. Their hands tightened on the chains out of habit, not malice, but even habit carried weight when it led you down a hall with no return. She kept her breathing steady. That was all she could control. Each inhale carried a memory. Koda bounding beside her on morning runs, his tongue lolling, his ears bouncing with every stride. Each exhale carried the ache of loss, the hollow reminder that those days were gone. But the rhythm grounded her. Left, right. Step, breath. The chamber was colder than she imagined. Sterile, stripped of anything human. A table, straps, machines humming like insects. She felt the tremor in her knees, but she forced herself not to stumble. If this was the end, she would meet it standing, even if they strapped her down. Even if they erased her name, they couldn't erase the way Koda had carved her back into the world with his howl, his fight, his refusal to let her vanish. She closed her eyes as they lowered her onto the table. Not in surrender, but in memory. She saw him again, not in that sterile room, but in every moment they had lived. His nose nudging her awake when she fell asleep at her desk. His bark cutting through the chaos of a chase, guiding her back to safety. His eyes, amber and unflinching, meeting hers through the glass of the visiting room. His body breaking locks and rules and chains just to reach her one last time. A voice read words she didn't hear. A hand touched her arm, cold and clinical. And then, just faintly, through the rain that tapped against the window, she thought she heard it, that sound. That howl. Long, low, filled with a grief too vast for language. Her eyes snapped open. For a moment, the sterile walls blurred, and all she could see was Koda, pressed against the gates. Rain dripping from his muzzle, his chest heaving with the force of his cry. She smiled, soft, almost imperceptible. They thought it was nerves. They thought it was resignation. But it wasn't. It was connection. A thread stretched between them, unbroken by walls or chains or even death. When the machines hummed louder, when her body slackened, the guards said it was over. Procedure complete. But outside, beyond the gates, Koda remained. His paws dug into the mud, his body trembling not with weakness but with unyielding resolve. Rain poured over him, soaking his fur until he glistened in the dim light. He didn't eat. He didn't leave. He simply waited, amber eyes locked on the walls that had taken her. Days passed. The photo of him, soaked, unflinching, stationed like a sentinel of grief, circulated across the world. Some called it proof of blind loyalty. Others said it was something sacred, something humans had forgotten. But no one could deny the image burrowed into the collective heart. A German shepherd who would not abandon his human, even when the world had. The prison staff whispered about it in hallways. Some admitted they avoided the gate at night, because his howl carried through the dark like a mourning hymn. A few guards left scraps of food, though he rarely touched them. They said he would lift his head only when thunder rolled, his ears straining, as if listening for a voice that no longer came. Weeks later, one of the handlers who had known him best found him still there, leaner, ribs visible beneath his coat, but eyes still burning with that same untamed devotion. The man knelt, whispered her name, and Koda's ears twitched. He pressed his muzzle into the chain link fence, breathing slow, as though her scent lingered there. The handler wept, not because he believed in redemption, not because he thought the system was wrong, but because in that moment he saw something purer than judgment could contain. Koda never truly left the gate. Even when they tried to move him, he would find his way back, paws bleeding, muzzle scraped, body refusing surrender. The world kept moving, new cases, new verdicts, new storms, but he remained, a figure carved against the backdrop of concrete and wire. And so her story did not end in the sterile chamber. It lived on in him, in the howl that split the rain, in the photo that stirred questions no law could silence, in the image of a dog who waited and waited and never stopped waiting, because some freedoms cannot be granted by courts and some chains cannot be cut by keys. Some are born in the marrow of love, in the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog, and Koda carried that bond forward, standing in the rain, amber eyes lit like fire against the dark, proving that even in the shadow of death, love had the final word. The rain became his shroud. Each morning the prison staff expected to find him gone, either driven away by hunger or collapsed under the weight of his own exhaustion. But Koda stayed. He stayed when the sun rose pale and indifferent over the barbed wire. He stayed when the moon spilled silver over the watchtowers. He stayed when days blurred into weeks, ribs sharpening beneath his coat, his paws rubbered raw against gravel. He would not move, not for hunger, not for comfort, not even for hands that tried to coax him into warmth. His place was at the gate, and his eyes never wavered from the walls that had taken her. At first, they mocked him. Some guards muttered about, "Stupid dog wasting away for nothing." Others tried to chase him off with shouted threats, but even then he did not budge. He lowered his head, pressed his muzzle against the chain link, and simply waited. It was not defiance. It was devotion carved so deep into his marrow that nothing could pry it loose. Then came the photograph. A young guard, barely out of training, snapped it one dawn when the fog still curled around the prison yard like smoke. Koda stood in profile, rain dripping from his whiskers, his eyes fixed on the grey walls beyond. The image was stark, unembellished, almost biblical in its quiet intensity. The guard posted it online, thinking little of it. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The world stopped to look. Comment sections filled with grief and awe. Headlines screamed, "The dog who waits for the condemned." Editorials debated what it meant. Was it blind loyalty to a disgraced officer, or proof that love transcends human judgment? Talk shows replayed the image, hosts wiping tears from their eyes as they spoke of the bond between handler and dog. Across continents, people who had never heard her name before suddenly whispered it, tethered forever now to the story of the German shepherd who would not abandon her. Letters began to arrive at the prison gates. Some scrawled in ink, others printed neat on thick stationery. They came from children who drew pictures of Koda standing guard with a high-low above his head. They came from old veterans who wrote of the dogs who had saved them in wars. They came from strangers who had no love for the woman inside, but could not deny the truth in the animal's vigil. The warden bristled at the attention. Media trucks lined the road outside. Cameras caught every frame of Koda lifting his head at thunder, every tremor of his body as he refused food. "It's a distraction," the warden grumbled. "This is not a zoo." But even he began to slow his walk each morning, pausing at the window to watch the shape of the dog through the mist. Even he felt it, that unexplainable pull, that reminder of something raw and human in a place built to strip humanity away. And still Koda endured. He began to change, though. His body thinned, but his eyes only grew fiercer, burning with an intensity that unnerved even the hardest guards. They said he wasn't just waiting. He was guarding, as if some part of him believed she might still walk back through those gates. His ears twitched at every shift of the lock, every rattle of the chains. He sprang to his feet at every shout carried on the wind. Hope, foolish or holy, refused to die in him. For the woman, gone now into silence, her story should have ended. But because of Koda it didn't. The world remembered her not for the gavel's strike, not for the sterile chamber, not for the judgment written in cold ink. They remembered her through him. The way his body broke gates to reach her, the way he pressed himself against her shackled hands, the way he stood drenched in rain, unyielding against the emptiness she left behind. And perhaps that was a different kind of justice. Not the one the courts spoke, but the kind born in the marrow of loyalty. Justice that said here was a bond the world could not erase, no matter how many chains it forged. Winter crept in. The rain hardened into sleet. Ice formed at the edges of the fence where Koda leaned his muzzle each night. The handlers, finally moved by something beyond duty, began to bring blankets, food, water. Sometimes he accepted it. More often he pushed it aside, eyes still trained on the walls. It was not comfort he wanted. It was her. One night, when the snow lay thick and the wind howled like wolves across the yard, an old guard walked past and stopped. He had been there the day of her verdict. He had watched her shackled and dragged away, had thought nothing of her but another case in a long line of cases. But seeing Koda there, half buried in snow, shivering yet unbroken, something inside the old guard cracked. He knelt, placed a trembling hand through the fence, and whispered into the storm, "She's gone, boy. She's gone." Koda lifted his head, eyes glowing in the moonlight. He didn't move. He didn't turn away. He simply stayed, as if to say, "Then I'll wait here until she isn't." And in that moment, the old guard wept, not just for the woman or the dog, but for the part of himself he had buried beneath years of iron and rules. The story never ended in neat lines. It never closed the way files do when stamped and shelved. It lingered, in photographs, in whispers, in the sight of a German shepherd standing against a world that had already chosen to forget. And maybe that was enough. Maybe her redemption, her freedom, her true legacy lived not in overturned verdicts or forgotten crimes but in him. In the howl that split the rain, in the unyielding watch at the gates, in the reminder that love, once given, cannot be caged or condemned. Because even when the world declared it over, Koda stayed. And as long as he stayed, so did she. Snow melted, seasons turned, and still Koda's paws marked the earth outside the prison gates. He never saw her walk free. Yet in his vigil she lived on, etched into every heartbeat that refused to leave her behind. People came and went, some with cameras, some with prayers, but Koda asked for nothing. His loyalty became her redemption, his silence louder than any verdict. And when at last his body gave way to time, the ground where he lay was no longer a prison gate. It was a monument, proof that love, once given, can outlive even death itself.